February 19th, 1945. Iwo Jima. Japanese gunners in reinforced concrete pillboxes watched the first wave of American landing craft approach the volcanic black beaches. Through binoculars, they observed something unexpected among the Marines storming ashore, black American faces among the assault troops. Japanese commanders had studied American military structure carefully. They knew the US military was rigidly segregated. They knew black soldiers were relegated to support roles, stevedores, supply handlers, drivers. They knew, or thought they knew, that Negro troops would never be allowed in frontline combat, especially not in the Marine Corps, which had only begun accepting black recruits 2 years earlier. What Japanese defenders didn't know was that the very segregation they'd observed had created a desperate situation. Black Marines, trained as ammunition handlers and depot companies, were about to become combat troops out of sheer necessity. The battle for Iwo Jima would require every man who could hold a rifle, regardless of the color line the Marine Corps had drawn. Over the next 36 days, Black Marines would fight, die, and prove their combat capability on one of the Pacific War's bloodiest battlefields. They would serve in roles they'd been systematically denied, under fire that didn't discriminate, proving that courage under fire has nothing to do with skin color. This is the story of how Black Marines broke barriers on Iwo Jima's beaches, not by choice, but by necessity, and how their service challenged assumptions on both sides of the battle. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. These are the stories that reveal the truth about who fought and died for America. The United States Marine Corps maintained a strict racial barrier longer than any other American military service. From its founding in 1775 until June 1942, the Marines accepted only white recruits. The unofficial motto among Marine recruiters was clear: the Marine Corps is looking for a few good men, and by men, we mean white men. This wasn't unofficial policy hidden in practice. It was official, documented, and defended by Marine leadership. When pressure mounted during World War II to integrate the armed forces, Marine Corps commandants argued that racial integration would undermine unit cohesion, that white Marines wouldn't fight alongside black men, that the Corps' elite reputation depended on exclusivity. President Franklin Roosevelt's Executive Order 8802 in 1941, prohibiting racial discrimination in defense industries and military service, created pressure the Marine Corps could no longer resist. In June 1942, the Marines reluctantly began accepting black recruits for the first time in the Corps' 167-year history. But acceptance didn't mean equality. The Marine Corps created a separate training facility at Montford Point, North Carolina, geographically isolated from the main Marine training base at Camp Lejeune. Black recruits trained in segregated units, lived in segregated barracks, and were explicitly told they would serve in support roles only, never in combat infantry positions. The first Black Marines who completed training in 1942 were assigned to depot companies and ammunition companies, units designated for loading supplies, handling munitions, and supporting combat operations from rear areas. The assignments weren't accidental. Marine Corps leadership believed black men lacked the intelligence, courage, and discipline for frontline combat. Training reflected these assumptions. While white Marine recruits trained in infantry tactics, assault procedures, and combat leadership, Black Marines received training focused on loading techniques, supply management, and manual labor. The message was unmistakable: you're here to serve, not to fight. By early 1945, approximately 19,000 black men had enlisted in the Marine Corps. They served in the 51st, 52nd, and other defense battalions, in depot companies, and in ammunition handling units. Not one had been assigned to a combat infantry regiment. Not one had been given the opportunity to prove themselves in battle alongside white Marines. This segregation extended beyond training and assignment. Black Marines faced discrimination in promotions, with a severe shortage of black NCOs because white commanders refused to promote them. They were denied access to the same recreational facilities as white Marines. They endured racial slurs from fellow service members and were often treated worse than German or Italian prisoners of war held at the same bases. Yet these men volunteered. They endured the discrimination because they believed military service would advance the cause of civil rights, that proving their worth in uniform would challenge the racism that denied them equality at home. They also believed, despite official policy, that they would eventually get their chance to fight. Historical records document the frustration among Black Marines denied combat roles. Letters home expressed their determination to prove themselves if given the opportunity. Training logs show Black Marines practicing infantry tactics in their spare time, preparing for combat roles they were officially prohibited from filling. An American general, observing Black Marine units preparing for Pacific deployment, wrote in his assessment, "These men demonstrate exceptional discipline and motivation. Their exclusion from combat roles appears based on prejudice rather than capability. Should circumstances require their employment in frontline positions, I have confidence they would perform admirably." The assessment was filed and ignored. Marine Corps policy remained unchanged. Black Marines would serve in support roles only, until Iwo Jima's brutal mathematics made that policy unsustainable. Iwo Jima represented one of the most challenging objectives American forces would face in the Pacific War. The island measured just 8 square miles, roughly the size of Manhattan from Wall Street to Central Park, but Japanese commanders had spent months transforming it into a fortress. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi commanded the Japanese defense, and he'd studied American amphibious tactics carefully. He knew the U.S. typically won beach assaults through overwhelming firepower and rapid inland advance. Kuribayashi designed his defense to neutralize both advantages. Rather than defending at the waterline where naval gunfire could destroy them, Japanese troops dug into the island's interior. They constructed 11 miles of underground tunnels connecting over 1,500 fortified positions. Concrete pillboxes with walls up to 3 feet thick housed machine guns and artillery. Cave complexes carved into Mount Suribachi's volcanic rock created firing positions that were nearly impossible to destroy. Kuribayashi had 21,000 troops under his command: Marines, naval infantry, and army units. He gave them explicit orders. "Every man will resist until the end, making his position his tomb. We will defend this island with our lives and inflict maximum casualties on the Americans before their inevitable victory." American intelligence underestimated the challenge. Pre-invasion assessments predicted the island would be secured in 5 days. Naval bombardment would soften defenses. Marines would land, push inland, and overwhelm the outnumbered Japanese garrison quickly. These predictions ignored the reality of Kuribayashi's defenses and the determination of Japanese troops to fight to the death. They also ignored the mathematical reality of casualties. American planners estimated 50% casualties among assault troops, meaning half of all Marines landing on Iwo Jima would be killed or wounded. This casualty rate created a logistics problem that would eventually involve Black Marines in ways military planners hadn't anticipated. Iwo Jima required constant resupply of ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, and equipment. The volcanic sand beaches made vehicle movement difficult. Supplies had to be manually unloaded from landing craft, moved across beaches, and transported to frontline units, all under Japanese artillery fire. The 8th Marine Field Depot, the 33rd, 34th, and 36th Marine Depot Companies, and the 8th Ammunition Company, all Black Marine units, were assigned to support operations. Their mission: keep supplies flowing to combat troops regardless of enemy fire, beach conditions, or casualties. What planners didn't account for was that support operations on Iwo Jima would mean operating in a combat zone where the distinction between frontline and rear area didn't exist. The entire island was a battlefield. Every position was within range of Japanese artillery. Supply personnel would face the same dangers as infantry and would need to fight back when attacked. Japanese intelligence, meanwhile, observed American preparations and noted the presence of Negro troops in support units. Japanese commanders understood American racial segregation from propaganda materials and intelligence reports. They assumed, based on American military structure, that black troops would remain in rear areas and wouldn't pose a combat threat. A Japanese intelligence assessment captured after the battle stated, "American Negro units assigned to labor and supply duties. These formations not trained for combat operations. Focused defensive fire on white infantry units, which represent primary threat." This assumption would prove as flawed as the American belief that 5 days would be sufficient to capture Iwo Jima. At 0900 hours on February 19, 1945, the first wave of Marines hit the beaches. Volcanic black sand made footing treacherous. Landing craft struggled to reach shore as waves pushed them sideways. Marines jumped into water, waded through surf, and encountered terrain unlike anything they'd trained for. The volcanic sand wasn't like normal beach sand. Boots sank 6 inches with every step. Wheeled vehicles became stuck immediately. Tracked vehicles struggled. The steep terraces rising from the waterline created natural barriers that channeled Marines into predetermined killing zones. For the first hour, Japanese defenders held their fire. American commanders, accustomed to immediate resistance on Pacific beaches, found the silence unnerving. Then, as more Marines landed and the beaches became crowded with men and equipment, Japanese artillery opened up. Mortars and artillery shells rained down on beaches packed with Marines. Machine gun fire from hidden positions swept landing zones. The casualties predicted in planning estimates began accumulating with terrifying speed. Within hours, wounded men covered beach aid stations. Dead Marines lay where they'd fallen, waiting for burial details that couldn't keep pace with the killing. The supply situation became critical immediately. Combat units advancing inland needed constant ammunition resupply. Artillery batteries firing in support consumed shells faster than landing craft could deliver them. Medical units required plasma, bandages, and morphine. Every necessity had to cross those beaches under fire. This was where Black Marines entered the battle in force. The depot and ammunition companies began landing on D-Day, tasked with establishing supply dumps, unloading landing craft, and moving materials to forward units. They landed expecting to perform support duties. They encountered a combat zone where support meant working under artillery fire, while Japanese snipers targeted anyone moving on the beaches. The 8th Ammunition Company, composed entirely of Black Marines except for white officers, began operations within hours of the initial landing. Their job was to establish ammunition supply points, unload shells from landing craft, and transport ammunition to artillery batteries and frontline units. The work was brutally physical. Artillery shells weighed up to 90 pounds each, and had to be done while under constant enemy fire. Historical records document that ammunition handlers suffered casualties comparable to infantry units during the battle's early days. Japanese artillery targeted beach supply areas deliberately, knowing that destroying American ammunition would cripple the assault. Black Marines unloading supplies became casualties simply by being on the beaches where shells fell indiscriminately. One Marine officer recorded in his after-action report, "Negro Marines of Ammunition Company performed duties under fire with exceptional courage. Several were wounded while unloading landing craft. They continued working until physically unable to do so. Their dedication to mission was indistinguishable from frontline infantry." But the situation deteriorated beyond supply operations. As casualties mounted among infantry units, the distinction between combat and support roles began to blur. Black Marines assigned to depot companies found themselves manning defensive positions when Japanese counterattacks threatened supply areas. Ammunition handlers picked up rifles to defend supply dumps when infiltrators attempted sabotage. The Marine Corps' careful segregation policy, designed to keep Black Marines away from combat, collapsed under Iwo Jima's brutal reality. When a Japanese squad attacked a supply position, the Marines defending it didn't check skin color before returning fire. When a position needed defending and every rifle counted, commanders stopped worrying about racial integration policies. One Black Marine corporal later recalled, "They told us we weren't good enough to fight." Then on Iwo Jima, when the Japanese came at our position, nobody cared what color we were. They handed us rifles and said, "Hold this line." We held it. By D-Day's end, several Black Marines had been killed in action. Many more were wounded. They died and bled doing the same work, facing the same dangers as white Marines, except without the official recognition that they were serving in combat roles. The casualty reports listed them as Depot Company or Ammunition Company casualties, not combat infantry casualties. But the bullets and shells that killed them didn't distinguish between support troops and assault troops. Neither did the work they performed under fire. The battle for Iwo Jima didn't follow American predictions. The 5-day estimate proved catastrophically wrong. Days stretched into weeks. Casualties mounted beyond initial projections. The island's geography, volcanic rock that absorbed shrapnel, underground tunnels that protected defenders, terrain that negated American armor advantages, made every yard gained costly. Black Marine units continued their supply operations under conditions that deteriorated daily. The beaches, already difficult terrain, became death traps as Japanese artillery zeroed in on landing zones. Supplying frontline units required moving through areas under constant observation and fire. The 36th Marine Depot Company, assigned to operate supply dumps just inland from the beaches, suffered casualties that forced them into defensive combat repeatedly. When Japanese infiltrators attacked at night, seeking to destroy American supplies, Depot Company Marines fought them off with small arms and grenades. These weren't trained infantry tactics. They were desperate defensive actions by support troops forced into combat roles. One senior Marine officer observed the situation and recorded, "The distinction between combat and support troops has become meaningless on Iwo Jima. Every Marine on this island is in combat, regardless of his assigned specialty. Negro Marines in depot companies have performed combat duties with courage equal to any troops under my command." The ammunition companies faced particularly dangerous work. Artillery batteries consumed shells at unprecedented rates during the sustained fighting. Ammunition handlers had to maintain constant supply flow, moving heavy shells from beach dumps to gun positions while under fire. Japanese artillery deliberately targeted ammunition supply routes, knowing that disrupting American fire support would give defenders an advantage. Historical records document specific instances of Black Marines distinguishing themselves under fire. When a landing craft loaded with ammunition took a direct hit near the beach, nearby ammunition handlers rushed into the water to prevent secondary explosions and recover what they could, while under continued artillery fire. When Japanese troops infiltrated American lines and threatened a supply dump, Black Marines organized its defense and held their position through a night-long firefight. These actions went largely unrecognized at the time. Black Marines who performed combat duties weren't recommended for combat decorations because officially they weren't serving in combat roles. They were supply personnel who happened to be shooting at the enemy, defending positions, and dying under fire. But the paperwork classified them differently. The Japanese, meanwhile, discovered their intelligence assessments about American Negro troops were wrong. Captured Japanese documents from Iwo Jima indicate surprise that Black Americans were present in combat zones and were fighting effectively. One captured diary from a Japanese soldier noted, "Negro American troops observed fighting near supply areas." Previous intelligence indicated these troops were non-combatants. They fight as aggressively as white Americans. By the battle's third week, several Black Marines had been killed in action and dozens more wounded. The casualty rate among ammunition and depot companies approached that of some infantry units, reflecting the reality that on Iwo Jima, everyone was in combat, regardless of official designation. One particularly deadly incident involved an ammunition dump that took a direct hit from Japanese artillery. The resulting explosion killed or wounded over a dozen Marines, most of them black ammunition handlers who'd been working to resupply frontline artillery. The explosion was visible across much of the island, a reminder that supply operations on Iwo Jima were as dangerous as any infantry assault. The physical demands combined with constant danger created conditions that broke some men and revealed the extraordinary resilience of others. Black Marines continued working 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer, moving supplies under fire, defending positions when attacked, and maintaining the logistics that allowed the battle to continue. A white Marine officer commanding a depot company later testified, "I went into this assignment believing Negro Marines were suitable only for manual labor. After Iwo Jima, I know I was completely wrong. The men under my command performed as well as any Marines I've served with. Several deserve combat decorations they'll never receive because of how the Marine Corps classifies their units." The battle for Iwo Jima officially ended on March 26, 1945, 36 days after the initial landing. American casualties totaled 26,000, including nearly 7,000 killed. Almost every Marine who landed on Iwo Jima was either killed or wounded, making it proportionally the costliest battle in Marine Corps history. Among those casualties were Black Marines, whose service challenged the segregation policies that had tried to keep them out of combat. Exact casualty figures for Black Marines on Iwo Jima remain incomplete in historical records, partly because they were listed under depot and ammunition companies rather than combat units. But available documentation indicates at least several dozen were killed or wounded. More significantly, their service under fire demonstrated that the Marine Corps' racial segregation policy was based on prejudice rather than military necessity. Black Marines had performed combat duties when required. They'd defended positions, fought off attacks, and continued working under fire that would have justified any soldier seeking cover. They'd done everything asked of them, except receive recognition for it. The official Marine Corps history of Iwo Jima, published shortly after the war, barely mentioned Black Marines' presence on the island. Combat narratives focused on infantry regiment actions. Supply operations received minimal coverage. The contribution of depot and ammunition companies, the unglamorous but essential logistics work that made the battle possible, was largely omitted. This omission wasn't accidental. The Marine Corps, still deeply segregated in 1945, wasn't eager to publicize that Black Marines had served effectively in combat roles. Doing so would undermine the justification for continued segregation. If Black Marines could fight effectively on Iwo Jima, why shouldn't they be allowed in infantry units? The question was too dangerous to answer, so the service was simply not discussed. Some individual recognition occurred. A few Black Marines received letters of commendation from commanding officers. Some were promoted for their service. But the combat decorations typically awarded for the actions they'd performed, Bronze Stars, Navy Crosses, even Medals of Honor, were not forthcoming. The official position remained that they'd served in support roles, regardless of what they'd actually done. The Japanese perspective revealed through post-war interrogations indicated surprise at Black Marines' combat effectiveness. Japanese soldiers captured on Iwo Jima reported that American Negro troops fought with the same intensity as white Marines, contradicting the propaganda they'd received about racial inferiority. Some expressed confusion that America fielded segregated units at all, finding the racial policies difficult to understand from their perspective. One American officer, reflecting on the battle years later, stated, "Iwo Jima proved that courage has no color. Black Marines performed every duty asked of them under conditions that broke stronger men. The Marine Corps' refusal to acknowledge their combat service was a disgrace that took decades to partially correct." That correction came slowly. The Marine Corps began desegregation in 1948, following President Truman's Executive Order 9981, though full integration took years to implement. The Montford Point Marines, the first generation of Black Marines who'd trained in segregated facilities and served in segregated units, received formal recognition in 2012 when they were collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, Congress's highest civilian honor. But by 2012, most Montford Point Marines had passed away. The recognition came too late for the men who'd stormed Iwo Jima's beaches, who'd worked under fire, who'd fought when needed despite being told they weren't good enough for combat. They'd waited nearly 70 years for acknowledgement that their service mattered. The story of Black Marines on Iwo Jima reveals uncomfortable truths about American military history. That racism shaped military policy even during existential war. That Black Americans volunteered to serve a country that denied them equal rights. That military necessity eventually forced changes that justice alone couldn't achieve. That recognition, when it finally came, arrived generations too late. The Japanese troops who expected only white Marines to storm Iwo Jima learned otherwise. The Marine Corps leadership that believed black men couldn't fight learned otherwise. The segregation policies that tried to define who could serve in combat learned otherwise. But the lesson came at tremendous cost, paid primarily by Black Marines who proved their worth while being denied recognition for it. They fought not just Japanese defenders, but also the racism of their own service. They won both battles, though recognition of that victory took 7 decades to arrive. Their service on Iwo Jima's volcanic beaches, under fire that didn't distinguish by race, performing duties they'd been told they weren't qualified for, stands as testimony to courage that transcends the prejudices that tried to deny it. The Japanese never expected Black Marines to storm Iwo Jima. The Marine Corps never intended for them to serve in combat roles. Reality had different plans than either side expected. And Black Marines met that reality with courage equal to any troops in American military history, whether or not the official histories acknowledged it.